Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou was the UFC heavyweight champion and one of the most terrifying knockout artists in MMA history. The conflict with Dana started during contract negotiations when Ngannou wanted boxer-level pay, the right to box on the side, and health insurance for fighters. Dana refused, publicly downplayed Ngannou's star power, and repeatedly said he didn't deserve what he was asking for. The tension escalated when Ngannou won the title and still wouldn't sign the contract the UFC offered. Dana's frustration became obvious in press conferences where he dismissed Ngannou's demands and compare him unfavorably to other heavyweights. When Ngannou's contract expired in 2023, Dana let him walk instead of meeting his terms. Ngannou left the UFC, signed with PFL for better pay and freedom, and immediately got a boxing match with Tyson Fury, where he nearly won and made more money than his entire UFC career combined. Dana was asked about it and basically said Ngannou made a mistake. The relationship is pure business hatred. Dana hates when fighters have leverage and use it, and Ngannou did exactly that. He proved the UFC wasn't the only path to making money in combat sports, which is the exact message Dana doesn't want getting out to other fighters. Ngannou called the bluff and won, which is why Dana still brings him up negatively whenever asked. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz has been a problem for Dana White for over a decade, not because of skill, but because of attitude. Diaz constantly complained publicly about pay, called out the UFC's business practices, refused fights he didn't want, and trash-talked Dana directly on social media and in interviews. He didn't play the company game, wouldn't do promotional obligations he thought were stupid, and made it clear he didn't care about being the UFC's model employee. Dana hated that Nate had a massive fan base that gave him leverage to act however he wanted. The conflicts were constant. Nate would go on Twitter and blast the UFC for underpaying fighters, call Dana out by name, and publicly demand better contracts or specific opponents. Dana would fire back in interviews, calling Nate difficult to work with and saying he didn't deserve main events. But every time Nate fought, the pay-per-view numbers were strong, which meant Dana couldn't just cut him. The relationship was mutual disrespect held together by money. When Nate's contract finally ended in 2022, Dana let him go without much of a fight. Nate immediately went to boxing, made millions against Jake Paul, and started his own promotion. Dana downplayed it, but the reality is Nate was one of the most popular fighters in UFC history, and Dana couldn't control him. That loss of control is what Dana hated most. Nate never needed the UFC as much as the UFC wanted to control him. Tito Ortiz. Tito Ortiz was one of the biggest stars in early UFC history, but his relationship with Dana White became one of the most personal feuds in MMA. The hatred started over money and ego. Tito wanted to be paid like the star he was, and Dana thought Tito overvalued himself. Their public battles were brutal. Dana called Tito stupid in interviews, and Tito fired back calling Dana a bully and a liar. The bad blood got so personal that they almost had an actual boxing match to settle it, which fell apart when Tito pulled out with an injury. The peak of the hatred was when Tito left the UFC in 2008, trashed Dana in the media, and signed with a rival promotion. Dana went scorched earth, calling Tito washed up, irrelevant, and desperate. When Tito eventually came back to the UFC in 2009, it was uncomfortable for everyone. Dana barely promoted his fights, and the disrespect was obvious. Tito retired in 2012, and Dana made it clear he was happy to see him go. Even years later, Dana still talks about Tito negatively when asked. The hatred isn't just business, it's personal. Tito represented everything Dana hated. A fighter who thought they were bigger than the company, demanded more money than Dana wanted to pay, and publicly challenged his authority. They genuinely dislike each other, and neither has ever pretended otherwise. Randy Couture. Randy Couture was a UFC legend, multi-time champion, and one of the most respected fighters in the sport. The conflict with Dana started in 2007 when Randy publicly resigned from the UFC, citing lack of respect, poor pay compared to what the company was making, and frustration with how the UFC treated fighters. He didn't just leave quietly. He held a press conference and laid out his grievances publicly, which made Dana look bad and gave ammunition to critics of UFC fighter pay. Dana responded aggressively, calling Randy ungrateful and saying he was breaking his contract. The UFC sued Randy to prevent him from fighting elsewhere, and the legal battle dragged on for over a year. Dana trashed Randy in interviews, said he was being manipulated by bad advisors, and made it clear he felt personally betrayed. Randy eventually settled and returned to the UFC in 2008, but the relationship was never the same. Dana stopped promoting him as heavily, and Randy retired in 2011 without much fanfare from the company. The Randy situation was bad for Dana because Randy was respected and credible. When he spoke out about fighter pay and mistreatment, people listened. Dana hated that Randy used his platform to challenge the UFC's business model publicly. Even after Randy came back, the tension was obvious. Dana got what he wanted, Randy back under contract, but he never forgave the public challenge to his authority. Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor Emelianenko is considered by many to be the greatest heavyweight of all time, but he never fought in the UFC, and Dana White has spent nearly 2 decades downplaying his legacy because of it. The UFC tried to sign Fedor multiple times in the late 2000s, 2000s, but Fedor's management demanded terms Dana wouldn't agree to: co-promotion with his Russian organization, freedom to compete in Sambo, and fighter-friendly contract terms. Dana refused, negotiations fell apart, and Fedor went to fight for rival promotions instead. Dana's response was to trash Fedor publicly whenever possible. He called him overrated, said he was afraid to fight in the UFC, and claimed the only reason people thought Fedor was great was because he fought cans in Japan and Russia. Every time Fedor lost a fight outside the UFC, Dana would bring it up as proof that he was never that good. When the UFC bought Strikeforce and finally had a chance to sign Fedor, he was past his prime, and Dana had no interest. The Fedor hatred is about ego and legacy. Dana needed Fedor in the UFC to legitimize the heavyweight division, and Fedor didn't need the UFC to be considered the best. That independence made Dana furious. Even now, when people bring up Fedor as one of the all-time greats, Dana downplays it and points to his losses. The hatred isn't personal. It's because Fedor represents a legacy outside UFC control, which Dana can't stand. Wanderlei Silva. Wanderlei Silva was a Pride legend who joined the UFC when they bought Pride in 2007. The relationship with Dana was fine at first, but it fell apart when Wanderlei started speaking out about fighter pay, the UFC's treatment of athletes, and the Reebok sponsorship deal that hurt fighters financially. The breaking point came in 2014 when Wanderlei ran from a random drug test, got suspended, and then went on a public media tour trashing Dana and the UFC. He called Dana a coward, said the UFC exploited fighters, and encouraged other fighters to stand up for themselves. Dana's response was nuclear. He called Wanderlei a cheater, said he was irrelevant, and made it clear Wanderlei would never fight in the UFC again. When Wanderlei kept talking, Dana sued him for breach of contract and defamation. The legal battle lasted years, and Dana used every opportunity to trash Wanderlei publicly. Wanderlei eventually apologized and settled, but by then he was out of the UFC permanently and fighting in smaller promotions. The Wanderlei situation was ugly because it was personal and public. Wanderlei didn't just leave quietly. He used his platform to attack the UFC's business practices and called Dana out by name. Dana hates public challenges to his authority, and Wanderlei gave him a big one. The lawsuit was as much about sending a message to other fighters as it was about Wanderlei specifically. Dana won the battle, but the hatred is still there whenever Wanderlei's name comes up. Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley was a dominant welterweight champion who held the belt for nearly 3 years, but Dana White never promoted him the way he promoted other champions. The tension started because Tyron was outspoken about race, fighter pay, and what he saw as unfair treatment by the UFC. He'd call out the company publicly, demand title shots he thought he deserved, and complain when the UFC gave promotional priority to white fighters over him. Dana hated the public complaints and the racial angle, and their relationship deteriorated fast. Dana's frustration showed in how he talked about Tyron. He'd call Tyron's fights boring, even when they weren't, downplay his accomplishments, and push other welterweights over him in promotional material. When Tyron lost the belt in 2019, Dana seemed relieved and immediately stopped booking him in high-profile fights. Tyron eventually left the UFC in 2021 and went to boxing, where he fought Jake Paul twice and made more money than most of his UFC title defenses. Dana mocked him for it. The Tyron situation was frustrating for both sides. Tyron felt disrespected and undervalued despite being a dominant champion, and Dana thought Tyron was difficult and ungrateful. The racial component made it messier because Tyron genuinely believed he was treated differently than white champions, and Dana refused to engage with that conversation. The hatred was less personal and more about fundamental disagreement on how Tyron should be valued and promoted. Jon Fitch. Jon Fitch was a top welterweight contender in the late 2000s with an incredibly effective but boring wrestling-heavy style. Dana White hated Fitch's fighting style and made no secret of it, regularly trashing him in interviews for being unwilling to engage in exciting fights. The real conflict came in 2008 when the UFC tried to force fighters to sign away their likeness rights for a video game without additional compensation. Fitch refused, and Dana cut him from the UFC entirely as punishment, even though he was ranked in the top 5. The firing caused a massive backlash, and Dana was forced to bring Fitch back a few days later after other fighters threatened to walk. But the relationship was poisoned. Dana never promoted Fitch properly, constantly criticized his style, and eventually cut him again in 2013 after a loss, even though he was still a top 10 fighter. Fitch went to other promotions and continued winning, which made Dana's decision look personal rather than performance-based. The Fitch hatred was about control and entertainment value. Dana wanted fighters who put on exciting shows, and Fitch prioritized winning over entertainment. When Fitch challenged the UFC's authority over likeness rights, Dana made an example of him. It was a clear message to other fighters: do what the company wants or get cut, regardless of your ranking. Fitch represented the kind of fighter Dana didn't want: effective but boring, and willing to push back on unfair contract terms. Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez is a talented featherweight striker who became a problem for Dana White because of his refusal to take fights and his tendency to pull out of scheduled bouts. years. The conflict started when Yair turned down multiple fight offers in 2017 and 2018, claiming he wanted specific opponents or better positioning. Dana doesn't tolerate fighters turning down fights, and he publicly called Yair out for being difficult and unrealistic about his value. The tension escalated when Dana cut Yair from the UFC in 2018 for refusing a fight with Zabit Magomedsharipov. Yair responded by saying the UFC wasn't offering him fair opportunities and that he was being pressured into bad matchups. Dana fired back, saying Yair was making excuses and that plenty of fighters would take the opportunities he was refusing. The public back and forth made both look bad, but Dana had the power and Yair was out. A few months later, the UFC brought Yair back after he agreed to fight whoever they wanted, but the relationship remained tense. The Yair situation illustrated Dana's philosophy on fighter control. Fighters don't get to pick and choose their opponents or dictate when they fight, the UFC does. Yair tried to have leverage he didn't actually possess, and Dana crushed it. The hatred isn't as deep as with other fighters on this list, but the lesson was clear. Play ball or get cut. Yair learned, came back, and has been more cooperative since. But Dana still references him as an example of a difficult fighter when the topic comes up. Demetrious Johnson. Demetrious Johnson was the longest reigning champion in UFC history, defending the flyweight belt 11 consecutive times and widely considered one of the most skilled pound-for-pound fighters ever. The problem was that Dana White never cared about the flyweight division and openly admitted that Mighty Mouse didn't draw pay-per-view numbers the way the UFC wanted. Dana would downplay Johnson's accomplishments in interviews, rarely promoted his fights heavily, and made it clear he thought the lighter weight classes didn't sell compared to heavyweights and welterweights. The frustration was mutual. Johnson felt disrespected by the lack of promotion and the constant narrative that he wasn't a draw despite being dominant and never losing. He'd speak out about it occasionally, but Dana's position never changed. The numbers didn't lie, and flyweight didn't move the needle. The breaking point came in 2018 when the UFC traded Johnson to one championship in exchange for Ben Askren, treating one of their greatest champions like a trading card. Dana acted like he got the better end of the deal, hyping up Askren while barely acknowledging what they gave up. The trade was disrespectful on multiple levels. Johnson was still in his prime, still champion and still unbeaten in years, but Dana wanted him gone because he represented a division that didn't make money. Shipping him to an Asian promotion for a welterweight who hadn't fought in the UFC made it clear star power and marketability mattered more than skill or legacy. Johnson went on to dominate in one championship, and Dana rarely mentions him when talking about UFC greats, which says everything about how little he valued the flyweight era.